Our lesson today comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, and we'll read verses 24 through 30. So now hear this portion of God's holy word. From there, he, Jesus, set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know that he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. And we're always grateful for these stories of Jesus and for the opportunities to share them with each other. I sometimes refer to this as that doggone story about the Syro-Phoenician woman. And the reason I say that is because I really, really wish that the dog were gone from this story. It's a hard one for me to grapple with because when we hear Jesus say something like, "The children should be fed first, and it's not fair to throw the children's food to the dogs," that comes across as a pretty harsh thing for Jesus to say. We would expect Jesus to say something like that to Pharisees or to scribes or to elders who are spending so much of their time and effort opposing Jesus. But we don't expect to hear Jesus say something that sounds so harsh to a woman who has done nothing more than anyone else has done to Jesus, coming in search of the healing power that only he can offer. And so it becomes one of those times that we raise our eyebrows, we shrug our shoulders and wonder what in the world makes Jesus say something that sounds so harsh. It's one that we've wrestled with for years. In fact, Matt, I try really hard to sympathize with your circumstance because I was a young associate pastor 25 years ago now probably when I had one of the most embarrassing experiences of my life brought about by the senior pastor with whom I worked. He was reading this passage and preaching on it one particular Sunday morning, and the configuration in that sanctuary was that my seat was such that I faced the other wall. The congregation was to my left, and usually the senior pastor was there in the pulpit on the other side preaching. And there was a modesty wall or a partition wall right to my left. And sometimes if I got pretty embarrassed, I could just slide down behind that wall. And those were the times when I would make myself a note on the bulletin that I would expect to receive phone calls and visits the next day. Well, on this particular Sunday, dealing with this particular passage, he says, "Look what's going on here. Here's a woman. And Jesus refers to her as a dog. And you know what we call female dogs? And it's almost as if Jesus is saying to her, hey, and he actually said the word. And when he said that word, I slunk down behind the wall. Because I thought, there's no way he just said that right out in front of God and everyone. And I think he took his exegesis of the passage a little too far because I don't think that's exactly what Jesus is up to here, but he points out how difficult this passage is because we don't want Jesus coming across sounding as if he's, if not harsh, at least condescending. But we consider the context. And Mark tells us several times in this passage, enough so that the message ought to be loud and clear to us, that Jesus has crossed over a line before he has this conversation with the woman. We get two phrases. He set out. That should be enough for us to know that he's going somewhere different. Followed up by a different phrase. He went away. So we know there's a journey involved here. And Mark tells us that he's gone to the region of Tyre. Now, very often, without flipping over to our maps in the back of the Bible, these names are just names to us. But Tyre is a region over on the Mediterranean coast that is no longer considered by Jesus' time in the story a part of the nation of Israel. It is Syro-Phoenician, Gentile territory. So Mark's earliest readers hear that Jesus has set out and gone away on a trip into Gentile territory. Not unheard of in the Gospels, because Jesus does that on several occasions. But he tells us in the very next verse, the second part of this verse 24, that he did not want anyone to know where he was. So it sounds like Jesus has reached a point in the story where he just needs to get away. Just needs to have a few moments to himself. And we have those moments in our lives, don't we? A time when we need to get to the other part of the house to be away from the people with whom we share the house. A time when we have that conversation that needs us to get away from the person or the coworker or the friend who has a differing point of view. A time when we just need to cool off a little bit. And looking back at the preceding chapter, no wonder Jesus needs a little time away. Chapter 6. The preceding chapter begins with Jesus going to his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. And as he proclaims the ministry that he's part of, his hometown synagogue studiers say, "Who is this guy? Isn't this the carpenter's son? And he's going to come and say these things, claiming a relationship with God." So, of all places, Jesus runs into rejection in his hometown synagogue. Well, as chapter 6 continues, he learns that his relative, and we hear in Luke's gospel that Elizabeth and Mary are kinspeople. So in our southern Appalachian way of keeping track of relationships, we believe that Jesus and John the Baptist are cousins in some way. I'd have to pull out the cousin chart to find out how many times removed they are. But he's related to John the Baptist, and John the Baptist is the one who has set the stage for him. He has told people to listen to Jesus because he's seen the Holy Spirit fall upon him. He has gone to prepare the way. And in chapter 6, Jesus discovers that King Herod has had John the Baptist executed, off with his head. The one who played such an important role in getting Jesus started is no longer there to continue to prepare the way for Jesus. As chapter 6 continues, Mark gives us a big clue about the relationship of Jesus and his disciples in verse 52, when Mark tells us in sort of an editorial statement, the disciples did not understand about the loaves in the miraculous feeding that happened earlier in the chapter, but their hearts were hardened. Sometimes as parents, we run into that phenomenon when our children seem reluctant to learn lessons. Sure, they learn how to tie their shoes, and they learn how to write. But my goodness, is there anything harder in the world than to teach a child to share? Maybe we look upon children even now in 2021 and think their hearts are hardened. Who would have thought that in a house full of toys, that one toy would be the one that everyone had to have at that very moment? She didn't say it loudly enough for you all to hear it, but I think I just heard Jenny say amen, talking about her two boys in her house. So Jesus is dealing with these hardened-hearted disciples. And then as chapter 7 begins, the immediately preceding passage to the one we've shared together today is 23 verses long, talking about Jesus' conflict with Pharisees and scribes who are critical of him because his disciples don't do the things that they think they ought to do. They don't follow, according to verse 3, the traditions of the elders in terms of keeping their hands clean, keeping their food clean, maintaining a ritual purity. And after they have helpfully fussed at Jesus, he returns the favor in verse 8 when he says, "You abandon the commandment of God and hold on to human tradition." So you imagine how much more intimate his relationship with those Pharisees and scribes becomes at that moment. They're becoming more bitter to him as the gospel continues, and Jesus is becoming increasingly frustrated with them. So after having those conflicts with his hometown crowd, after having that frustration with his disciples, after feeling that sense of loneliness and maybe even fear over the loss of John the Baptist, and having yet another confrontation with these very influential Pharisees and scribes, no wonder Jesus needs to get away. And so maybe that contributes to his frustration when the woman comes and kneels before him. But not only that, Jesus is probably continuing a habit that he's known since birth, because it's likely that even in his household, there was some sort of differentiation between the two kinds of people in the world, the Israelites and the Gentiles. And Jesus has crossed over into Gentile territory in verse 24. But if you have your Bible open before you, look at verse 26. We might expect this woman would be a Gentile because she lives in a Gentile territory. But again, Mark makes sure to drive it into our awareness that she is a Gentile, because he says, now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician, which means Gentile, origin. So she's a Gentile woman living in a Gentile land of Gentile origins. Does everybody get the idea now that this woman is a Gentile? And so there's this distinction between Jew and Gentile at work here. Jesus has had his vacation disrupted, but he's had his vacation disrupted by someone who is so different from him. Earlier in the gospel stories, in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7, verse 6 of Matthew's gospel describes Jesus as saying, do not give what is holy to the dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine. They will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you. And the reason for distinguishing between holy and dogs, or something that is precious and swine, is that those are two animals that most Israelites would recognize as relatively unclean. And the reason for that is that swine are omnivores. They'll eat anything. I remember really well my grandparents' house right across the driveway from mine, under the sink, had a yellow bucket that anything that was peeled off, a potato peel or an apple peel or anything that was left, an apple core, or even the fat that was trimmed off of a steak or a roast, it all went into what was called in our house the slop bucket. And the slop bucket would be taken at the end of the day and poured into a trough where the pigs were. And you should have seen the feeding frenzy, because they'll eat anything. So in the Old Testament law, that made them unclean. So Jesus is saying there in Matthew's gospel, don't put clean stuff in front of the unclean. And the same thing is true there with the dogs. I don't know that I would have made a good Israelite in the first century or before, because my dog wouldn't have been able to hop up on my lap and give me kisses on my cheek. That would have been considered something that would make me ritually unclean. I said dog. My other three dogs probably got a little bit feeling like they were left out. My dogs couldn't hop on my lap. I'm a dog person, and I love those dogs, but in that type of world in which there are two kinds of people, Israelite and Gentile, there are also two kinds of animals, clean and unclean. And dogs are not necessarily omnivores, but because dogs will also exhibit a scavenger kind of behavior, because it's not unheard of for a dog to come trotting up the driveway carrying a dead animal that it's found, because it's not unheard of for dogs to dig up a recently buried dead animal, that contact with death makes them unclean. And so the Israelites didn't look at them as the sweet little household pets to be called and loved on and to receive kisses from. They looked at them as the ones to be avoided because their contact might make us ritually unclean. And so maybe that's what Jesus is referring to in that Sermon on the Mount. And maybe there are people who would come to mind when he mentions throwing what is holy before the dogs. But certainly way back in 1 Samuel, When King David, who is not yet King David, stands across the way from that giant Goliath with only the things that he's used to protect the flock, things like maybe a rod and a staff and a sling. Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 43, shouts across the divide, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" So there is this idea among the Israelites that to refer to someone as a dog was to refer to them as a Gentile. Maybe that's what Jesus is up to. Not just naming her as someone who has been a frustration to him, but naming her in the same way that any other Israelite might name her. To show that there is that natural condescension from the Israelites upon the Gentiles. To say that there is this divide between two kinds of people, the Israelites and the Gentiles, the clean and the unclean. We don't know why Jesus does that. Is it perhaps just to test the woman? Is it perhaps just to demonstrate the difference between the two of them? And there are obvious differences. Not only is she a Gentile and he is an Israelite, but we compare this story to another one in the Gospel of John in chapter 4, in which Jesus meets that Samaritan woman at the well. And do you remember in that passage when Jesus' disciples arrive on the scene, they are astonished. And that's the word that the New Revised Standard Version uses. They're astonished because Jesus is speaking with a woman. So here is Jesus speaking with a Gentile, but also speaking with a woman. And maybe he's simply trying to demonstrate the differences that exist between them. Or, as some scholars suggest, maybe he's testing her faith. And why wouldn't he? Chapter 6 has been full of disappointments about the faith of the people of Israel. Certainly, he learned long ago about the Pharisees and the scribes and how they would never come to believe in him and ultimately to believe in the manifestation of God's power that Jesus exemplified. But it has to be a disappointment to Jesus that his disciples have had their hearts hardened and are not able to fully appreciate who he is. Certainly, it has to be a disappointment to Jesus to step into his hometown synagogue and to have those people almost laugh at him. Get a load of this guy. The carpenter's son thinks that he's something that he is not. So maybe Jesus has had enough of disappointment and simply wants to know whether he's headed for another. So notice the woman's response. Yes, the food is set on the table for the children of Israel, but yes, even the dogs are allowed to eat the crumbs that fall off the table. And I learned this lesson when I was able to visit Israel several years ago. The table was set before us, and I noticed that I didn't have a fork, I didn't have a spoon, I didn't know how this was going to happen, so I decided to watch the host and see what happened. And with the big plate or tray of pita bread in the center of the table, he'd tear off a piece and scoop food onto his plate. And then he'd tear off a smaller piece and scoop food into his mouth. And then at the end of the meal, he described to us that even though we had reached a 20th century level of sophistication, according to which we would wipe our hands on napkins, he talked about passages like this one particularly and said in the first century we believed that the day-old bread was used sometimes to gather the grease and the food residue off a person's hands, and the crumbs were dropped into the floor. And those tasty crumbs then became maybe food for the dog that would come under the table that the woman's describing here. It's the leftovers. It's the cast-offs. And that's what she's saying. Just give me some of what you have. Compare that to his experience in the preceding chapter. Those people want nothing to do with him. In the case of the Pharisees, scribes, and his hometown synagogue, and they don't believe or don't understand what he has to offer in the case of his disciples. But this woman seems to get it. She seems to know that he offers hope for her daughter. She seems to realize that even though there are so many differences between the two of them, Jew, Gentile, man, woman, that can be surmounted. And that's a lesson that Pharisee and scribe have not yet learned. they see their differences with Jesus as absolutely insurmountable. Notice that Mark never mentions the woman's faith. In Mark's gospel, Jesus simply responds, "For saying that, your daughter is healed." And it might be the case that Jesus is just so impressed with her quick comeback that he decides to offer a gift, to give her a crumb, as it were. But it might be because she exemplifies a faith he's not seen elsewhere, that he is able to do what he has not done to this point in Mark's gospel. In every other instance of healing up to this point, Jesus has laid hands on a person, or Jesus has spoken to a person. Notice in this case, the woman returns to her home. Jesus has never been there. He's never seen her daughter. He's never touched her daughter. He's never spoken to her daughter, but he has healed her daughter. Maybe it is that because of her faith in even the crumbs of what Jesus has to offer, her daughter receives healing. This is such an unlikely story. If we were living there in the first century of Israel, we would expect that of all people, the Pharisees and the scribes would be the ones to receive the greatest blessing because they were looked upon by their contemporaries as the ones having the greatest connection to God, the greatest faith. We would expect from the outside looking in that if anybody's going to experience the greatest blessing, it would be those disciples walking day by day with Jesus, seeing over and over and over again the power of God at work within him. But their hearts are still hardened. This woman apparently is soft-hearted. And the most unlikely person Jesus encounters, a Syrophoenician Gentile of Syrophoenician origin, living in the region of Tyre, is the one who receives great blessing because she would settle for the crumbs of what Jesus had to offer. Sometimes when we're about to gather around the table for Holy Communion, we carry with us ideas about who might receive the greatest or the least blessing. Because of what Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, it's been tragic to me that across the years I've had people in congregations who would say, "I don't participate in communion because Paul warns us against participating in communion in that letter to 1 Corinthians. If we haven't gotten our lives sorted out, and I don't want to insult God by participating in communion in my broken, sinful state." And that doesn't seem to be what Paul was saying in my estimation. Paul was saying, don't step up to the table thinking that it's just a regular, ordinary meal. Step up to the table realizing your need for grace, and maybe the most broken are the ones who can best receive the crumbs from Jesus' table. But whether we feel that we're the most likely or the least likely, and whether we have those feelings or entertain those ideas about any other person or any other group of people out there, I believe the lesson of the Syrophoenician woman that we carry over to this table is that Jesus is willing to set the table for all. Jesus is willing to go across the boundaries into the territory of the unclean, the impure, the Gentile, the woman, boundaries that most men in his position would not have crossed in the first century. And Jesus is willing to share grace, not only with those who are closest to him, no matter how hard their hearts might be, not only with those who reject him, no matter how long they've known him, not only with those who would oppose him, but with those who simply come seeking for something, anything that they might hold on to as a source of blessing.